Hi, everyone. I'm Elaine Quijano. It is good to be with you. Thanks for joining us. President Biden is ending negotiations with a group of Republican senators looking to find a new path to bipartisanship. It comes as one of the Democrats' most crucial Senate votes wants to keep reaching across the aisle. West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin met with civil rights leaders this afternoon after his public opposition to passing Democrats' voting rights legislation without any Republican support. After the sit-down, he told reporters, quote, "I don't think anybody's changed positions on that." Back at home in West Virginia, the conservative Koch network is reportedly funding a pressure campaign to push Manchin to oppose the White House agenda. At this rate, the issue of voting rights looks likely to join the list of legislation blocked by the filibuster. Also on that list, a commission to study the January 6th Capitol riot. The Senate released its report on security failures leading up to the insurrection. It details the failures inside the Capitol Police plan to protect the building, but largely omits the role played by former President Trump. And it appears a glitch rather than a hack took thousands of government news and social media sites offline Tuesday morning. The outage came at a period of increased concern about cyber attacks as we learned about another ransomware attack, this time impacting dozens of members of Congress. More on that in a moment. But first, President Biden is preparing for his first official trip abroad this week, capped off with his face-to-face summit with Russia's President Vladimir Putin. To Press Secretary Jen Psaki, this is a trip decades in the making.
He's been getting ready for 50 years. He has been on the world stage. He's known a number of these leaders for decades, including President Putin and including a number of the leaders he'll see at NATO and he'll see at the G7. Now, this is an important opportunity for him to see them in person, and there's nothing like face-to-face engagement in diplomacy.
Vice President Harris is on the tail end of her trip to Guatemala and Mexico, where she met with both countries' presidents. She's facing some backlash from inside her party after discouraging asylum seekers from coming to the U.S.
The goal of our work is to help Guatemalans find hope at home. At the same time, I want to be clear to folks in this region who are thinking about making that dangerous trek to the United States-Mexico border. Do not come. Do not come.
For more, let's bring in Maya King and Russell Contreras. Maya is a reporter covering national politics for Politico, and Russell is a race and justice reporter for Axios. Welcome. Good to have you both. Russell, let me start with you. So this bipartisan Senate report found the Capitol Police Department was aware of the potential for violence in the days and weeks ahead of January 6th. Now, there's a lot of criticism about the Capitol Police's response and very little about former President Trump. Here is some reaction from both sides. Let's listen to that.
With the exception of a brief reference to former President Trump's remarks at the ellipse, Senate Republicans insisted that the report exclude anything having to do with the cause of the insurrection. If anything, the joint report by the Homeland Security and Rules Committees has strengthened the argument for an independent commission on January the 6th.
Today's report is one of the many reasons I'm confident in the ability of existing investigations to uncover all actionable facts about the events of January 6th. I'll continue to support these efforts over any that seek to politicize the process, and I would urge my colleagues to do the same.
So could we see a renewed effort to investigate the former president's role into what happened on January 6th?
That's going to be the question that keeps coming up. Right now, there is still pressure to create a Kerner Commission type independent body to look into January 6th. This tells us that this is not going away. Regardless of any report that comes out today or subsequently after, whether it's in a House committee or any other investigations, there's still going to be a push to look into some sort of independent commission to tell us what happened, who was involved, how organized was it, who was funding it. Because right now, as it stands, it looks like one side of the aisle is trying to block it, to block any independent investigation, to stall it. And the other side is saying, let's get down to the bottom of it. Now, of course, politics does play a role. It really will depend on who is on what side of the aisle you stand on and whether there should be a commission. But what this tells me is it's not going away. As 2022 approaches, the more this is kicked down the road, it's punted, it's going to remain an issue. And I doubt very seriously that this won't become an issue in the 2022 elections.
Right, yeah, it's likely there will be continuing questions raised about what took place and what led up to January 6th. On another topic here, Maya, Vice President Harris is facing criticism for both telling migrants to not attempt border crossings, as well as not actually visiting the southern border. How is she responding to this?
The vice president and her team have been very clear about the reasons why she was at the border or why she went to Guatemala and to Mexico, which was to deliver the message that she and the administration are very committed to improving conditions in those countries. And her response to that interview question about whether or not she had actually, or the fact that she had not gone to the border, was that her administration, the Biden-Harris administration, had had a presence there, that they were actively working on the issues that were driving migrants across the border. And so, I think in the eyes of Harris and her spokespeople and allies, whether or not she herself has a presence at the border is more of a non-issue. It's really the fact that she's working on the issues that are bringing people across the border and telling them, look, stay where you are in your home countries, and that she, as vice president, is charged with improving those conditions there to make it the more viable option.
And Maya, Senator Shelley Moore Capito announced the end of negotiations with the White House on infrastructure. So what happens next, and what are you hearing about this Republican fallback plan?
Well, I think the biggest gap between Democrats and Republicans on infrastructure right now is paying for it. There's about a $700 billion gap between what Democrats are willing to come down on from their original $3.5 trillion plan and what Republicans were willing to meet and sort of be flexible on. And so the next steps here now are Democrats very largely saying that they'd like to move forward without Republicans on this topic. And there is a bill that House Democrats have put forth that they plan to pass in the coming weeks. And they are going to continue to do their best to try to actually get legislation passed on infrastructure to begin the process of paying for it and having the government involved in this effort. And I think, though, is also there's this very, very flexible, very fluid definition of what exactly infrastructure is, which has been one of the hangups in these conversations between Democrats and Republicans after a global pandemic, an economic downturn that has impacted hundreds of thousands of people in this country. Democrats are very interested in expanding the definition of infrastructure as one way to justify the fact that it does come with a very hefty price tag. Republicans were a lot more interested in maybe borrowing from coronavirus relief funds to try to pay for this infrastructure plan, but that was not something that there was any compromise on. And so, again, next steps are really is continuing to dash hopes of bipartisanship in Washington as both parties go their own way on trying to figure out exactly how they're going to, one, define infrastructure, and two, begin the process of enacting that.
And Russell, President Biden's domestic agenda seems a little more precarious now that West Virginia Senator Joe Manchin has pulled support for the administration's voting rights push. Tell us about his meetings today, Russell, related to that decision.
Well, Manchin's being hit, especially from civil rights leaders and civil rights advocates, to really reconsider his position on the filibuster and on the voting rights bill. Not only that, you have someone like William Barber, the Reverend William Barber, who's coming from the Poor People's Campaign, launching a campaign in West Virginia with other faith leaders to really push the West Virginia senator on this measure. This coincides as you start to see Hispanics across the country really upset with some of the administration's policies on immigration and others. We mentioned the Vice President Harris. She went down and said, do not come. On my social media feed, Latino activists, especially immigrant activists, were really upset with that. They feel that that was a slap in the face. They wish she had gone down there and apologized for the U.S. role in creating the conditions in places like Guatemala and El Salvador, and even acknowledging that the violence that we're seeing in these countries we are partly responsible for it. We trained some of these members in our own gang culture, and then we deported that. But instead of that acknowledgement, instead of being accountable, she said, do not come. And this was especially hurtful for some immigrant activists because the vice president is the product of two immigrants, privileged immigrants nonetheless, but immigrants none themselves, and then gave this message. I think there's a lot of discontent among Latinos, and there's some discontent among civil rights activists of where this domestic agenda is going today.
Really interesting to hear that reaction, Russell. Maya, former President Obama expressed concerns about Republicans' willingness to push narratives about fraudulent elections. Here's what he told CNN.
The base believed it because this had been told to them not just by the president, but by the media that they watch. And nobody stood up and said, stop, this is enough. This is not true. I won't say nobody. Let me correct it. There were some very brave people who did their jobs, like the Secretary of State in Georgia, who was then viciously attacked for it. And all those congressmen started looking around and they said, you know what, I'll lose my job. I'll get voted out of office.
So Democrats have challenged this narrative, and the one high-profile Republican who did was forced out of her leadership position. So how defining will this issue be going forward?
It absolutely is the defining issue, especially for the Republican Party moving forward into 2022. The GOP in Georgia voted over the weekend to censure Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger for his decision really to, as the former president defines it, do his job to certify the election results. I mean, this is starting to become an identity crisis for those on the right and how they're going to move forward, essentially in playing by the rules for the United States government. And I think Republicans have started to take sides on this by saying that as long as this is the issue that animates the base, they're very willing to sort of dance around the talk of certifying election results and what exactly constitutes a fair and balanced election. I think it also gets at a lot of the debate that's been happening on the Hill right now around voting rights. There are a number of bills being passed in state legislatures right now, largely by Republican-led legislatures, aiming to decrease access to the ballot after what happened in 2020, after suffering the loss of the presidency from Republicans. A lot of what they've decided to do now is to continue to animate the base by passing legislation that sort of matches this talking point of whether or not an election is legitimate or not. And so that's something that Democrats are also aiming to counter, of course, by clearly defining what a fair and balanced and well-run, well-executed election looks like. And Republicans are starting to sort of shift their own definitions of this according to what exactly happens at the ballot and the conversations around what is a legitimate vote.
All right, in our final minute or so, Russell, you have been writing about how the concept of critical race theory has become a new front in the culture wars. First of all, what is critical race theory and who's behind this sort of push? How is this issue playing out?
Well, real quick, critical race theory is a framework developed in the 1970s that says our nation's foundation is ingrained with systemic racism that goes back to the way the Constitution, the way we describe African Americans, or the way we describe Native Americans in the Declaration of Independence. It really is an attack on systemic racism. The backlash against it is from conservative groups who are not attacking systemic racism, but have crowdsourced and looked at polls to show if they use the term critical race theory, that provokes anger amongst the conservative base. So now there's an organized effort by conservatives to go to school boards, to go to state legislatures, to demand the banning of critical race theory, even though that's very hard to define. And as a result, free speech advocates are sounding alarm. And right now, college administrators are asking professors, are you a critical race theorist? They say this is very close to McCarthyism. Well, you might as well just ask, are you now or have you ever been a critical race theorist? And this comes at a time when we are diversifying as a nation, and there's a need for more voices of color in history and social studies. And as we diversify as a nation, there's pressure to really include diverse voices. But this front here, this argument is really going to be something that we should see as a 2022 wedge issue.
Yeah, it certainly is a new front in the culture wars. Maya King and Russell Contreras, thank you both very much.